Everybody, how are you? And hey, Rick, we are both here again. Welcome to everybody. My name is Ann Merchant, and I work for the National Academy of Sciences. And of course, I'm joined by
I'm Rick Lovard. I also work for the National Academy of Sciences. I am the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
And we are very glad that you are here. Gosh, I can't believe it's still only January. There's a part of me that thinks it should be, I don't know, May. And then there's a part of me that thinks it should be 2020. I don't even know what time is anymore. But we're very glad that you're spending time with us. We're really happy that you're here. And we love doing these film screenings. It feels like it's maybe part two for you because you've had the opportunity to watch the film, which means that this is sort of a continuation of an experience, which is really great. And we were so excited to be able to bring this film to you because, number one, I think that most people probably don't realize we have this advisory board, and Oliver Sacks was a member of the advisory board of the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So this feels really relevant and sort of personal for the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is great. But of course, the first thing that I'm supposed to do if I'm going to earn my paycheck is to explain what the National Academy of Sciences is. For those of you who've been coming to our events, you're sort of like, okay, I should have come 3 or 4 minutes later because I've heard this before. But the National Academy of Sciences is a private nonprofit institution in Washington, D.C. that was created in 1863 to sit outside the framework of government, to be able to sort of help the government steer a good course using the resources from science, engineering, and medicine to create good policy. And of course, we received a really wonderful message from our presidents. We have three presidents, a president of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine that welcomed in the new administration. We have been serving the administrations since 1863, beginning with Abraham Lincoln. And we're, of course, very excited that this administration embraces science with such enthusiasm. And of course, the notion that the science advisor would be elevated to a cabinet position was very welcome news. And of course, Eric Lander is both a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So that was really welcome news for us. And the Biden administration has expressed specific interest in 4 key areas where the Academy can, we believe, be extremely helpful. And of course, one is the pandemic review and response, where we feel we've had a lot of contributions already and will continue to be useful. The economic recovery for all Americans as we go forward. The leadership on climate change. And that's something that the academies has been, I've been with the Academy for 30 years and our contributions in that sphere predates my employment with the institution. And then, of course, advancing racial equity. So we have already informed the administration that we stand ready to provide continued advice in all of those areas. So we're very excited. The other thing I did want to mention is that the announcement for the Public Welfare Medal has been made. And this is the highest honor that the Academy can bestow upon somebody. We've been making this medal available since 1914, and it probably is not a surprise that it has gone to Dr. Anthony Fauci. For his decades of contributions to the scientific community. So we are all extremely happy and very, very pleased that this has gone to him. So that's my spiel about the National Academy of Sciences. But of course, the Science and Entertainment Exchange is one of the flagship outreach programs for the National Academy of Sciences. And as the director, I want Rick for you to take it from here to explain that.
So if you are a writer, producer, studio executive, a storyteller, you're writing any form of media really, and you have a question about science, you can call us at 844-NEED-SCI, and we will connect you with a scientist who can help you understand the science of your project and put it in the context of the project you're writing. So since we opened our doors over 10 years ago, we've done over 300 events, 3,200 consultations on projects like Avengers Infinity War, Man of Steel, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, Songbird. We also do documentaries like Food Evolution by Scott Kennedy. And if you are a STEM professional and you would like to volunteer to be a part of this whole process and be connected to storytellers, please reach out, contact us. We are always looking for new people to do these kinds of consultations. I want to thank Sparks, the team at Spark Street, Taylor, Jenny, and Mark in particular for your work behind the scenes today. Also the office in DC, Courtney Sloan, Jeff Fishman, and Sachi Gerben in LA. Our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, who in particular sponsor all of our events online, but this one really in particular. Anne, did you want to say something about that?
Well, Tangled Bank Studios is probably something that maybe people haven't heard of, but if you haven't, you should go check it out because there's a division of Howard Hughes that is actually producing and financing films. And these are wonderful documentaries. And of course, Tangled Bank has an association with this particular film. So we strongly suggest that you check that out and make yourself aware of them.
So also the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Walt Disney Company, Film Nation, Google, Lyda Hill Foundation, Corteva, and individual donors like many of you. And I want to thank everybody who donated. You saw the slide for the first time of the folks who have donated at the supporter level. We thank you. If you donated in 2020, you should already have one of these little guys, these little coins that we've sent out. If you donated in 2021 or for this event today, thank you. Those coins are on order. It's going to be at least 3 weeks before we get them. We'll get them to you as soon as possible. And so for today also, normally we do, for our events, we have a Q&A as part of the event. Well, as we're doing the wind up for this event, we realized that there was so much to cover, so much to talk about with Oliver Sacks and his incredible life, as you know, all of you who saw the documentary will know, that we decided to bump the Q&A to a separate Zoom link that will happen after the hour is up. If you opted for that, you should already have that link. If you do not have that link, please send an email to theexchange@nas.edu, and we will make sure that you're hooked up with that link by the end of the hour. And back to you, Anne. I think that's what I got.
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, we will continue in our little tradition of giving you a bit of a personal rabbit hole item. And mine this week is, I think it's because I've been denied my opportunity to do much traveling. I was really intrigued to read an article about the Virgin Hyperloop, which seems like it's getting to be a little closer to reality. They're saying now it could be 5 years out. And I was especially interested in the fact that they are now investing their time in two forms of design, one of which is the sonic design, so that you are going to not hear the music, but experience the music, because it's apparently the only form of transportation that we will have previously experienced. An elevator has no windows, and we're only used to kind of going up in elevators that way, but everything else we have windows. So there's going to be a new way to experience the sound. And they have also had an olfactive designer come in, so that there will be a whole smell experience involved in it. So I'm now really newly intrigued by the Hyperloop. And I think Sachi is providing links to that, so you can go read that really interesting article about the Hyperloop. So I'm traveling in my mind at 600 miles an hour.
I have two really quick things to recommend. One, this book's been out for a while, but I'm just reading it this week, On Writing by Stephen King. Sort of a memoir about writing, but it also has a lot about sort of getting inspired about writing. I've been finding it really intriguing and interesting. And also, this put a smile on my face, this agate that was discovered this week that looks like Cookie Monster. And Sacha's going to that story too. Anyway, that just made me smile.
I know. I like it. I like it. So we're now going to hand it over to our panel. And of course, we're so happy that, you know, it's really interesting because what's great about this panel is that everybody on this panel personally knew Oliver Sacks. It's not like this is an intellectual conversation, although it likely will be, but it's probably going to be a very personal conversation, which I think it just makes it so great. And we were so pleased to get Neil Baer to moderate this for us, because Neil is one of our favorite moderators, because because he truly gets what the Science and Entertainment Exchange is all about. I think he embodies this whole notion of science and story and how this moves people at a level that really is important. And I also would be remiss if I did not mention the fact, because Rick, you said, the exchange is for documentary filmmakers too. And Rick Burns has been to a retreat that was sponsored by the Science and Entertainment Exchange, has cracked lobster claws with me at a table at our Woods Hole facility. And so we really do love our documentary filmmakers and are so pleased that we can have this group here together. And I think, Christoph, you had said, listen, I remember with the exchange when, in 2008, you guys were first talking about this. So everybody here has something to do with the exchange. And Kate, we're so glad that you're part of this conversation. So we're going to hand it all over to you because that's why our audience is here. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Anne and Rick, for bringing us together to talk about Oliver Sacks. I hope you all enjoyed the film. I know I did. It's beautifully lyrical, directed by Rick Burns. We're going to talk today to three people who knew Oliver extremely well. Oliver was a man of enormous passions. He was a man who can only be described in terms that are superlative. He was brilliant. He was a man who knew about 19th century neurological writings and used it in his work. He was a man who was one of the kindest people I've ever met, who was dedicated and devoted to his patients. He brought people who were marginalized because of their neurological disorders into the public's attention and helped us grow our own empathy towards each other through the stories that we read that he wrote in books like Awakenings, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, A Leg to Stand On, Uncle Tungsten, his autobiography, and many other books that I really recommend you read to take you into what it really means to be a human and all of our quirks. Speaking of quirks, Oliver was also one of the oddest, quirkiest men I had ever met. I was fortunate when I was a student at the American Film Institute, a directing fellow, I had to do a pitch. I woke up one morning listening to NPR Ira Flatow, and he was interviewing Oliver Sacks around 1984. And they were talking about his work. And I thought, oh, I could pitch a story like this. So I pitched it at AFI. And they were like, yeah, we don't know. But I was undaunted, and I reached out to Oliver. I optioned The Lost Mariner from The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is when I first met Kate. And we wrote it and sold it to Paramount, and it was had John Lithgow attached. And like many projects, it was never made, but we're hoping someday. So I got to literally meet Oliver on a number of occasions. One time, we were in San Francisco. He was going to be there, so I flew up to see him from LA. And we were taking a stroll, and he suddenly fell on the ground, and I was panicked. It's before I went to medical school, so I didn't know what it could be. He looked like he was having a seizure. I heard him muttering Fern, and I thought, who is Fern? Is that someone he knows? Is that a patient? And finally, he kind of relaxed, and he had a fern in his hand, and he said that this was a fern he'd never seen before, and that he was communing with it. So I thought, okay, this is Oliver Sacks and all of his extraordinariness. Another time I saw him in LA, he was in a swimming pool. He was a swimmer for his whole life. And he enjoyed, I think, getting away from folks by swimming and being kind of like a walrus. And so when I was talking to him about the contract, he would submerge every time. So I called him the Leviathan because he was this enormous man of power, but of such great gentleness as well. So I have these memories of Oliver that I'll always keep. And we're going to today talk about Oliver from the perspective of the film that Rick Burns directed. And Rick Burns is a documentarian extraordinaire with an astonishing number of films, over 20. He is the right person to have made this film, as you saw. And we'll be speaking to Kate Edgar, who's the executive director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation, and Bill Hayes, who was Oliver's romantic partner, as you know, watching the film the last several years of his life, wrote that Kate was Oliver's longtime friend, collaborator, and I'll add confidant. She really understood him and knew him and all of his splendor. We also have Christoph Koch, who is a neuroscientist at the Allen Institute for Brain Science, the maven of consciousness. So he's going to talk about the extraordinary insights that Oliver lent to us through his beautiful writing. So we're going to design this in a little bit of a different way. We're going to have 4 chapters, and we're going to screen in a moment the first video. And the video will be our prompt for the 4 of us to discuss what it meant for Oliver, what it means to us. And that way we can help you, I hope, get to know Oliver even a little bit better with 3 people who knew him extraordinarily well. So let's start with the first video. This is Beginnings, we call it, Immersion in Science.
Oliver's empathy didn't start with people. It goes much beyond that. The first friends he had at 6, he says, were numbers. Numbers, then he went to minerals and metals at 10. Then elements, plants came before, and people. Humanity was the very last thing. That was a reaction to great suffering.
The love of chemistry and of the periodic table was an absolutely constant with me from an early age. I've loved the elements since I was 10 or 11. I have a periodic table bedspread on my bed. I have shopping bags with periodic tables. I have many periodic table t-shirts, and I have some periodic table socks.
From the very beginning, he had a real relationship with inanimate objects. He carried a periodic table in his wallet like the rest of us carry a driver's license.
I love it very much. It stands for order, stability, but it also stands for imagination and mystery.
He liked to get an element for each year to celebrate his birthday. Number 77 was iridium. And he came to my very primitive laboratory in London 10 years ago, and together we melted the iridium.
As I was going through my 70s, I felt I was living through them all. Hafnium, tantalum, tungsten, rhenium, 75, osmium, 76, iridium, 77, where's my platinum somewhere, 78. If you doubt reality, drop tungsten on your foot.
So extraordinary, right? Animals, vegetables, mineral. His curiosity was deep, unabiding, and profound. So we're going to start by talking about this curiosity about everything, but particularly about science that led Oliver to be one of the foremost writers about human beings. So we'll start with, I think, Kate, and then we'll just have a conversation because Kate knew him probably better than anybody else in the world. Kate.
Well, Oliver did cherish everything to do with science. He, as you saw in the film, he loved to collect elements, particularly or minerals, so that he would just sort of caress them and talk to them and admire them at every opportunity. They were everywhere. They kind of began to take over the office. But his love for science really went all the way from fondling these very concrete examples of nature, chemistry, minerals, to the most abstract concepts of physics or chemistry, structural chemistry. He loved to read biographies of scientists. That was pretty much his favorite reading, apart from Science and Nature when they came in the mail every week. And he once said, he wrote, "My religion is nature. That's what arouses those feelings of wonder and mysticism and gratitude in me." And, I think that just summarizes Oliver in a lot of ways, because he held on to that beautiful childlike sense of wonder and awe at all of the natural world.
Rick, what was your impression of Oliver's just profound curiosity? How did that strike you?
His publisher, Italian publisher, Roberto Colasso, who you saw briefly in that clip, kind of put his finger on him when he said, in another part of the film, he was the most childlike friend I ever had. And I think that quality that Oliver had of, it's sort of, we say childlike and we don't mean childish. I mean, childlike is sort of like, what is this? And why is this? These kind of very fundamental kind of interactive questions. And that quality of just being sort of having his nose literally and figuratively pressed up against the glass of reality. What is going on here? And it meant that there was like nothing that he couldn't be curious about. Because Kate, you talk about, nature and quote that lovely passage from Oliver. He was a natural scientist of reality. And that meant there weren't really important distinctions in terms of what aroused his curiosity between a rock or a mineral or a plant or a fungi or a patient or a human being or a writer or, so what I found thrilling about him, and it comes across powerfully in his writing, but it comes across, I think, even more viscerally in who he was, as a living human being. It's this sense of absolute sort of like breathtaking awe at just the simplest things in front of him. And there was something about that was, to be sure, could make you smile at the irrepressible childlike quality of it, but make you also feel rebuked in a positive way if you couldn't muster some, fraction at least of the sense of wonder that he felt towards pretty much every damn thing he came into contact with.
Christoph, how did that work? I love what Rick just said about Oliver pressed against the glass, but with his patients, he was right there. How did this curiosity work in his desire to penetrate the minds of people who may have been shunned or marginalized?
What he was so very good at until his dying day was because he had this childlike curiosity that many of us lose as we age and as we get used to the world, is always finding the particular, the idiosyncratic, the specific about this one individual that makes him or her experience the world in a very different way. Because let's say they have lost the sense of memory, or they lost the sense of where they are, they've lost the sense of space and time. And so he tries to go inside their mind and tries to see what is it like to be like that person, and to think you're back in the 70s, right? And as scientists, we're usually called upon to generalize, to see the world from a more, quote, objective point of view. Philosophers call this the view from nowhere. And he sort of, Oliver had the very opposite. He always wanted to see the particular, not to generalize, not to see the abstract, not to see the statistics of these sorts of patients versus those sorts of patients, but this one individual human, this one mensch, and what was his or her experience like. And that was just exceptional. The way the detailed of the way he described what people saw and felt and heard, and what he himself then described also, for example, in one of his books where he talks about, he had this ocular cancer that would ultimately, of course, come back indirectly to kill him. And when he had this cancer, he described, I remember in this book, how he had this area, this so-called scotoma, where that sort of it's a field of nothingness. But then he described, depending on the visual background, how it would fill in, how he could look at his leg, and how his once his leg was inside that scotoma, he could sort of decapitate it because it would suddenly disappear. And sort of he played around with his own visual deficits to try to understand it. It's just wonderful.
He was one of the greatest descriptors of the 20th and 21st century. And by doing that, I'll never forget when I started reading his pieces in the New Yorker, just kind of wondering, like, what, as you just said, he put us in the place of these people that he described, and it humanized us more. And it's unforgettable. And we really were able to put ourselves in others' places. And that's the only way that we can ever, through his storytelling, change hearts and minds. So he was so adept at that. And we saw that, of course, in his movie Awakenings, where he brought us to the people. We actually got to see Robin Williams playing him and Robert De Niro playing one of the patients from the flu epidemic of 1918. Fortunately, we're not seeing people frozen like Oliver did. We're going to move on to chapter 2, which is sexuality. I have a very short story, which is when I met Oliver the first time, as I said, he was a man of great strength, and he'd been a bodybuilder as a young man. And he also loved riding motorcycles, and he loved wearing leather. And I remember when he was telling me these things, I was thinking, this guy is gay, like me. But I think we're both, still in the closet, and he must have his reasons. So let's see this next clip, and we'll start to explore Oliver's childhood and how that had an influence on the work that he did.
When I turned 18, my father thought this was the time for a serious father-to-son talk. We talked about allowances and money. And then my father got on to what was really worrying him. You don't seem to have many girlfriends, he said. Perhaps you prefer boys, he continued. Yes, I do, I said. It's just a feeling. I've never done anything. Then I added, but don't tell Ma. She won't be able to take it. But my father did tell her. And the next morning she came down with a face of thunder, a face I had never seen before. You are an abomination, she said. I wish you had never been born. My mother was speaking, though I'm not sure I realized this at the time, out of anguish, as much as accusation. The anguish of a mother who, feeling that she had lost one son to schizophrenia, now feared she was losing another to homosexuality. She did not speak to me for several days. When she did speak, there was no reference to what she had said, nor did she ever refer to the matter again. But something had come between us. Her words haunted me for much of my life and played a major part in inhibiting and injecting with guilt my sense of my own sexuality.
So Oliver's struggles are written in his autobiography, and you can read it to really understand what he went through as a young physician coming to Los Angeles, to UCLA. It's quite compelling. It's quite moving and heartrending. Kate, you knew Oliver so well. How did this event that's so, what really struck me in seeing this time, is that his mother looked very much like him, or he looked very much like his mother. This is so interesting. It really struck me this time. How do you think that influenced the way that he did his work? You knew him for 35 years, and he was celibate for 35 years. So,
yeah, I mean, I think taking his mother's condemnation, which, frankly, the first time he told me that story, which was early on in our relationship, I was just so angry with her for many decades. He also had this terrible episode of being exiled to a sadistic boarding school during the war. Plus, he had this huge burden of knowing that his closest brother was mad. And all of these things were clearly very difficult. He talked about them with his inner circle a lot, but it was clearly very difficult for him. One theory that you might pose is that as an outsider in these ways, or even as a Jew in post-war England, he felt a sympathy with the marginalized and those people who had no voice. I'm not really sure if I believe that, or if I feel like he just innately had such a quality of attentiveness and compassion. I just find it remarkable that those qualities survived these assaults on it during his youth and childhood.
It's certainly had an impact because he's written about it in his last op-ed pieces in the New York Times as well, which if you haven't read, folks out watching today, they're really, really compelling. And this notion of his being an outsider that gave him insight is something we hear a lot in queer narratives. And so he was definitely queer. From my experience meeting him and reading his autobiography and seeing the work of this, as you just said, Kate, reaching out to the others who are not embraced by the status quo. What was your feeling, Rick? I mean, you were shooting this, so you're right there when he's telling these stories. What was your sense of these moments in the film and with Oliver?
No, I didn't know until I spoke with you, Kate, on the phone the night you called in early January 2015 to say, Oliver's dying, will you come in and film him? I didn't know until that conversation that he was gay. And so I think it's worth really underlining, here in 2021, in a world in which hopefully we have moved, hopefully we will continue to move towards an inclusiveness that sees, sexuality in a realistic way. But to remember that Oliver was of Alan Turing's generation. Alan Turing, another remarkable mind, English, who was chemically castrated in the 1950s for his acknowledged sexuality. And to imagine what it would be like to be, in your teens and early 20s in a world in which the possibility of having your, something so fundamental as your, sexual feelings seared off like that is, it's kind of inconceivable, I think, in the 21st century for a lot of people. I think it's important to remember the degree of castigation and punitiveness that could be deadly, that was deadly. Turing killed himself. So I think in Oliver, what you could feel very much was the kind of like the raw openness and a kind of anger in him that was always right there. And that his posture, he had the double posture of someone who had the strength to be open, had the need to be reserved, and really was, in a certain way, never going to forget any of this. And I think it stayed with him, which is why, I felt early on that, Oliver was an atheist, English, homosexual Jew, which meant that he was bound to end up a lifelong New Yorker after he got to the city.
Right. And what's wonderful is that he did find love and he was able to fully come out before he died 6 years before when he met.
Remember, Neil, how long it was. I mean, his dear friend Isabel Rapin, a neurologist who, alas, has died since Oliver's death. But, he said, that it would have been professional suicide in the 1970s and 80s to have been openly homosexual as a neurologist. And to think that would be the case, and that was just obvious that would be the case. Thank God he did find, in the last 8 years of his life or so, a relationship that was deep and meaningful and rewarding. And it was one of the, I know Kate can speak to this, and Christoph as well, to, what a joy it was to see someone who had, gone through such a long period of abstinence.
It renewed him, his relationship with Bill Hayes, certainly for Oliver. And it was an unexpected but wonderful kind of denouement for his own personal story. And it's so amazing that it did take this long, but it did have like a wonderful outcome for him. Christoph, what are your thoughts in terms of how his own dealings with his sexuality affected the way he looked and treated patients and looked into the mind, and you knew him well. So what are your thoughts?
So it cannot but profoundly influence the way you perceive the world, right? Who we are and our identity, including our sexual identity, will profoundly shape the way we look at things, what draws our attention or what we avoid, whether you live it explicitly or implicitly, as he did in the closet. But what I found remarkable, and here I have to disagree with you, Rick, I could not detect. So I knew him for 15 years. We met pretty regularly because he was interested in the science that I was involved in this. And he was, of course, good friends with Francis Crick, my closest collaborator. And I could never detect any trace of anger or suppressed anger. I mean, I know when people have suppressed anger, but at least in my interaction with him, including dinners, etc., I could never feel the righteous anger that he could have had vis-a-vis his mom or the world in general that left him sort of unable to express some of his deepest desires. But I couldn't detect that. And I think he took that and put all that energy and frustration into these very different channels, deeply caring, being very passionate, being incredibly observant, and fundamentally deeply caring about individual specific people that usually by society are sort of left aside because they have a deficit of some sort or the other.
Yeah, the queerness, I see it that way, certainly that his queerness opened his eyes to people who were othered. And he really wanted to understand them because, without psychoanalyzing, he was, an other too. What's really fascinating, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but Oliver went through psychoanalysis for years and years and years. And it wasn't until, that's right, correct? Decades. And yet,
years.
50 years.
The American Psychoanalytic Association didn't change their views on homosexuality until the 1990s. What Rick was just saying. It was pathology. They were the last. The American Psychological Association changed in the 70s, but the analysts didn't change until the 90s. So here we have a neurologist seeing a psychoanalyst really struggling with who he was according to what he said, just in that even short clip, and yet being one of the most compassionate people one could ever meet. So these contradictions led to an extraordinary compassion and empathy. We're going to move, from that to, as we've been talking about a lot, his profound way of telling a story like no one else. So we're going to see a clip on narrative and storytelling, and then we'll chat about it.
Oliver saw medicine a lot differently from the way other people saw it. He was trying to conceptualize how people thought and how they saw the world. Oliver believed that there was some sort of cognitive, perceptual inner world for everything you saw on the exterior as a movement disorder, as a tic disorder, or even as a dementia.
He was somebody for whom the primary diagnostic question was, how are you? How do you be? He was extraordinarily empathic with his patients. He was asking as hard as a person can, who are you? I need to know more. I need to know even more. And his attention would release people. He could get secrets. He could learn things. And then he will tell stories about people in terrible trouble, who are brave and special and full of heart, paralyzed but not over, he will take this thread of them and he will pull them out, pull them slowly out. But what he also did simultaneously, which was the great part, is he pulled the whole world in the other way. He would tell these stories so well that other people, playwrights, actors, poets, would pick up the stories he tells, retell them, or tell them in their own way. And the net effect is that people who are lonely and left out, autistic people, Tourette's, people in all kinds of mental difficulties, are storied back into the world.
So, Kate, tell us about his storytelling life. And by that, I mean, did he write every day? Did he write constantly? And then also tell us briefly, you would get all the letters before email and then emails. What were people writing back about his stories?
Oh boy, those are some really interesting questions. He wrote all the time. He was never without usually a little bound journal notebook and an array of different colored pens, so he could scribble wherever he was. But he did write every day. Sometimes it was when he would see a patient, for instance, and you got to remember that he saw thousands of patients in his practice. He only wrote about a very, very small number of them, but he would, every time he saw anyone, he would go and write, 400 or 500 word consultation report, which was kind of unprecedented, I think, maybe at least for those times. And sometimes it would, of course, turn into more, and he would be amusing. And he would also write about pretty much anything, his dreams, his thoughts on chemistry, his reflections, as Christoph brought up, he would often do little perceptual experiments on himself. So he had to write. His brain was always forming words and sentences, sometimes when he was swimming, and he would have to rush out of the water and write them down. And I had to deal with some sort of waterlogged manuscripts for that reason. But once his writing started getting out into the world, he got a huge amount of correspondence from people, mostly saying, I really identify with that person you just described. Even to this point of saying, oh, I think I have autism, I never realized it. Or, oh, I never knew there was a word for the fact that I can't recognize people's faces. So there was a huge opening. Tourette syndrome is another example, something that was very little described before he started writing about it. So he loved getting those letters, and he would almost always reply at length. So I'm right now sitting on 65 bankers' boxes full of his correspondence.
Like out of the 18th century, it's
these could be anyone from a random reader right up to Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, who would write these incredible letters back and forth, sort of chewing on a certain neurological problem and what were the correlates of that. So he adored that.
And Rick, as the filmmaker, is there anything that sort of changed your view of storytelling in working with Oliver? Because Oliver was such a magnificent writer. Did anything strike you or move you in a way that really kind of changed the way you look at things now as a filmmaker?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, first of all, he said, made it very clear, and it was intuitively something one gathered about him, is that, the difference between talking and writing wasn't great to him. So that there was the importance of the voice in writing was really profound. So that kind of like taking out a pen and script and moving it across a piece of paper was akin to another form of speaking. and that sense in which it's a form of self-presence to the world was really, I think, deeply, deeply a part of how he operated and how he felt and how he went forward. And I think that in terms of the impact of his storytelling on me, and I think anybody who's a storyteller, is the most profound understanding, I think, was the degree to which he saw the stories that he was created as critical forms of data about the people he was writing about, including himself. That it wasn't something in this way in which, I was born in 1955, when C.P. Snow invented the phrase, the two cultures, the division between the scientific world and the artistic or humanities world. And I think Oliver deeply didn't believe in that, and that what he believed was that subjective experience, as it's experienced, is a crucial form of data about who a human being is. And of course it is. And so that his stories were not just simply charming, forms of anecdotal, intrigue that he would share, but that this was something which you couldn't in any other form, information that in no other form would exist. And so the idea that a story, this lovely, simple, in English, 4-letter word, is this potent message, like a message in a bottle, but the bottle's a human being and the story is the message, which is sort of coming out and will be there. Christoph, you once said, we'll be reading these 1,000 years from now if we're still here, because there's no other form of data about what it is to have had this form of experience. We might well have MRIs or CAT scans left over showing how the brain flashed and whirred as an experience. But the actual experience is going to be only available when a human voice is articulating that interiority and putting it into a form that is intelligible and engaging and really captures who that person was. So for anybody involved in storytelling, like any filmmaker, to feel that in a certain way he was helping one abolish distinctions between art, science, narrative, and realize it was all part of a kind of a continuum, a very plausible continuum, which was human experience. That was, I found, long in the tooth as I am, really transformative as something to think about it.
I think that's just really profound. What you're saying is that he took the data from his interviews and his examinations of patients, but also brought the emotion to it so that we could connect with it, but always grounded in science. Christoph, I'm going to ask you about the same question in terms of what his storytelling means for you as a neuroscientist, but I'm also going to talk about that in terms of consciousness. So we're going to start with you, and then we're going to the last chapter. So we're going to now, this was a great intro, thank you, Rick, to consciousness. And we're going to then come back to Christoph to really delve into that part of Oliver's work. And what does it mean to have consciousness? So here we go.
There are 3 fundamental problems in science that are truly fundamental. A, why is there anything rather than nothing? I mean, why is the world? B, how did the organic come about? How did life begin on this planet or anywhere else? And C, what is the origin of consciousness? They're all 3 questions of Genesis. The genesis of something out of nothing, the genesis of life out of the inorganic, and the genesis of consciousness out of the dead world. Scientists know it's the brain that gives rise to our conscious perception, to consciousness. And we've been trying to understand forever what's the relationship between the brain and its various constituent parts and the experiencing eye. And Oliver Sacks, of course, was very good at studying this experiencing eye and what happens in this condition or in that medical condition. What is it to live with certain types of afflictions? What is it to live without a memory? What is it if you're stuck always in 1982, as one of his patients was? What does it actually feel like from the inside?
So, Christoph, please continue. Tell us about the conversations you had with Oliver about consciousness, and how did Oliver's storytelling affect your work as a neuroscientist and the work you do on consciousness?
So in philosophy of mind, which is one of the oldest fields in philosophy, dates back to Aristotle, 2,400 years ago, there are these two contrasting views called the first person point of view and the third person point of view. Science specializes in studying things, whether it's black holes or viruses or protons or brains, from the third person point of view, from the external point of view. You weigh a brain, you put it in a scanner, you poke it, etc. The other point of view is the view that we all have. I am looking at the world. I'm looking at you now in my Zoom gallery, or the view of the person who is unable to see faces, or who has lost his memory. And until recently, because of the influence, particularly in America, of behaviorists, as scientists, you couldn't really talk about this, what the experience was. That was considered woo-woo. That was sort of for later on, for once you retired. Sort of serious scientists only study the objective, the third person. And then what Oliver did, in just this inimicable, extraordinary manner, he tried to connect, the world, the perspective of a particular person who has something that's unique to them, that isn't shared by anyone else, that by the external world is perceived as deficit, but for him, for the patient, it is his or her reality, and he tries to link that to certain objective things like, what type of brain damage. And so really this unique, to show that ultimately it's about consciousness, and to describe the particular aspect of consciousness, how does it feel, to have these various things, and then trying to connect that with the objective reality, which is why he talked to people like me and to people like Francis Crick. How does it connect? What's the exact relationship between the brain, which is the piece of furniture of the universe, like anything else, subject to the same laws, there's nothing magical about it. That's also what Oliver Sacks believed. And the experiencing subject. What is the exact relationship, and what happens when certain bits and pieces of the brain are mislaid or missing?
That's, such a wonderful way of explaining the objective and the personal, and how Oliver brought the two together in ways that help us as physicians really not see the patient as a compendium of symptoms. And, when I did the show ER, we were always, trying to play that part. And I think I was very influenced by Oliver because I'd read a number of his books by that point, and was always like, let's tell the story of the patient. If they're not just a series of labs. We have a few last minutes, so we'll go to Rick, and then we'll end with Kate on your thoughts about, where we are with Oliver now, and where we'll be going with him.
I think I'm left in a certain way right where this last topic that you focused on, Neil, and Christoph, with what you're saying about consciousness, that this remarkable, it wasn't as if Oliver Sacks simply also had, among his wide range of interests, an interest in consciousness, philosophically or neurologically. I think it was actually at the very, very center of what his work was about, of what his life was about. This amazing fact that we, all of us, and not just human beings, have consciousness, that we wake up in the morning, and in a wonderful moment, Christoph, that you gave to us, which we didn't include in the film, that, when you're asleep, nothing, as when you're dead, but then suddenly you wake up in the morning and the world forms itself around you again. And that experience is really the most precious possible experience. And so you could talk about what's that experience of, a beautiful world, a rainy day, a challenging moment. But there's also then simply the fact, which has got to be one of the greatest random gifts of these whirling set of atoms that we're all made of, that we're able to experience it and then share our experience. So that's the kind of elemental quality in Oliver in every sense of the word, that both what you experience and that you experience is something which exists and can be shared, is, I think, one of the greatest gifts that he gave, certainly me, but I think it was really something carried in all his writing, all his sort of way of being in the world, to a constant tacit reminder, an exemplary embodiment of that form of wonder, and a kind of the gratitude, which is just, we could have ended up, we could have all been rocks, but we weren't. And I think that's really a remarkable thing about Oliver.
It's so compelling.
Amen.
Of renewal. Every morning I love that moment of waking up, as you say, and coming into consciousness. Kate, can you end for us?
I mean, you guys have done such a beautiful job talking about this topic, but I would also say, Rick, I think you touched on the idea that part of it is the ability to share our own experiences. And this is what Oliver was trying to draw out from every individual patient. What is it really like to be you? And then he would try to describe that to the larger world. Maybe it was just the doctors and nurses reading that chart, or maybe it was readers of his books. But he felt very compelled to describe his own conscious awareness, as we know from a lot of his writing, and was keenly aware of the role of social community. This is one of the first things he did with the Awakenings patients, was he brought them all from disparate wards and put them together in one kind of community setting. So it's not only what's inside us, it's how we radiate that out to the larger world.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's, as you're just saying, it's, and Oliver wrote in his last essays for the New York Times, it's about our uniqueness. And once we're gone, that uniqueness is gone, but it can be left in the words and work that we do. And we have that of Oliver Sacks. Thank you, Rick. Kate.
I miss him. I really miss him.
I do too.
Well, in talking about him, I feel
Amen.
like I'm so lucky to know him, and everybody I've ever met has a story about Oliver Sacks, and that's what we're here for, to talk about the power of storytelling. So I'm going to turn it back to Rick and Anne, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Neil, for making this so wonderful for us.
This has been a
Thank
great.
you, Neil. Yes.
This has been a great conversation, and it's exactly right. These personal stories are exactly what I think our audience looks for with these talkbacks, because it's getting beyond what we see in the documentary. And of course, we thank somebody as talented as Rick Burns to bring this story to life. But it's a real treat to be able to have the conversation with all of you, because that's a little bit of extra, a little behind the scenes, a little something more that we can offer. And of course, we also have offered this special opportunity for people to join the VIP Q&A, I think is how we've put it, because you're all very important and special to us. So we hope that you will go over to that. We did want to tell you that we will shortly be sending around an invitation for next week, where we think we had to cancel last time, and it was an act of God, a Mother Nature kind of thing. But Seth MacFarlane is going to be talking with Dr. Larry Brilliant about the current state of the pandemic, asking a lot of questions of Dr. Brilliant, presumably questions that you two will have. And so we hope to be doing that on Instagram Live. And so stay tuned for more information about that. And we hope that the winds do not pick up in Los Angeles and foil our plans once again. But in the meantime, thank you all. We really appreciate, Neil, that was such a wonderful conversation that you moderated. Kate, you have such insights that you have brought from a lifetime of working with Oliver Sacks. And of course, Christoph, we so appreciate you being here as well, because the science that you bring to life in a way that is very special. And Rick, we want to get you back to eat lobsters with us in Woods Hole. So bring it on. Yes.
Absolutely. Bring them on.
So thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having us.
You.